Black Team's story begins the same as every other Spartan 2's. Stolen from their homes and families and indoctrinated into a cause they couldn't possibly understand at the horrifically young age of 6. Like every other Spartan 2, Black Team was selected due to their exceptional strengths of the mind and body. Not just anyone can become a Spartan 2. No, only the best genetics imaginable are worthy to wield Mjolnir. Not Thor's hammer, though that is where it gets its name. Much like the mighty Odinson's powerful weapon, Mjolnir power armor can only be equipped and used by those who are truly worthy. But Mjolnir armor doesn't have mystical properties that determine whether or not that's actually true. It's simply so powerful that normal humans cannot control its might. To attempt to do so would mean horrific dismemberment at best, and at worst, well, a fate worse than death. Those who aren't worthy of Mjolnir armor but attempted to harness its strength were not rewarded for their efforts. Instead, the armor's ability to amplify any motion the wearer makes was so strong that their limbs would overextend or simply be crushed by the slightest movement. Wielding Mjolnir armor requires not only great physical strength, but also intense mental discipline. The slightest over-exaggeration of motion can cause the wearer to do horrible things, but also incredible things. Experienced wearers of Mjolnir armor are able to perform physical feats entirely impossible to those without the armor's aid, such as running up to speeds of 60 kilometers per hour or 40 miles per hour, or flipping a warthog that weighs 3 metric tons or 6,600 pounds. Tasks as simple as shaking someone's hand can have horrible side effects if the armor's wearer isn't careful. The slightest bit of extra pressure used by the wearer could completely crush the other person's hand. As prodigious as the Spartan 2s may be, their incredible genetics and vast intellect were not enough to wield Mjolnir armor. In order for their bodies to become capable of such a feat, they must first be subjected to intense military training for many years of their lives, and eventually forced to undergo violent genetic mutations. Their bone structure would have to be strengthened. They would receive hormonal supplements, retinal surgery, protein injections to build muscle, and finally have their nervous systems massively altered. Most of these procedures were experimental and highly volatile. Of the 75 children stolen for the Spartan 2 program, only 33 survived the surgeries, some of which were left horribly disfigured. On top of all of that, these medical experiments had to be performed on prepubescent bodies in order to mitigate as many severe side effects as possible. Only then were the survivors that weren't disfigured able to equip and properly harness the abilities of Mjolnir armor. Only those who were truly worthy. Some of these Spartan 2 survivors would eventually form Black Team, a very unusual group of Spartans. Their group dynamic is odd and rather informal, and their relationships with one another are, to say the least, complicated. Black Team consists of 4 members. Margaret, 053, Black Team's leader, call sign, Black 1. Roma, 143, the intelligence specialist, call sign, Black 2. Otto, 031, the heavy, call sign, Black 3. And finally, Victor, 101, the sniper, call sign, Black 4. Together they make a strange, albeit formidable team of Spartans. Their early lives started out much the same as every other Spartan 2's. Training, years of it. And when the training became easy, augmentations. But eventually the details of their lives would diverge from the rest of the Spartan 2's. An event would occur that would change their dynamic forever and leave a few of them both physically and mentally scarred. Through all of that training, all of that time spent together, Spartans formed unbreakable bonds with one another. Bonds of brotherhood and sisterhood, and more. You see, Margaret and Otto started to fall in love. They kept their relationship secret, of course, even excluding Roma and Victor, their trusted team members. No one could know that 2 Spartans had an intimate relationship with one another, one very different from the typical sibling bond that most Spartan 2s share. Needless to say, their relationship wasn't exactly allowed, so they secretly stole moments with each other whenever they could. No one could know, especially not CPO Franklin Mendez, the man responsible for training the Spartan 2s. Even though Margaret and Otto revered and respected the man, they knew he would never approve of the love they shared, so they hid their feelings from everyone else. They would secretly pass notes in class to one another, undoubtedly professing their love. Eventually, they graduated to sneaking away into the bathrooms in moments of free time whenever the other 2s were preoccupied with training. Unbeknownst to the 2 of them, Victor started to develop his own feelings for Margaret and became increasingly jealous of Otto. Whether or not he was aware of his friends' private time together, or if he found out one day and the shock drove him to do what he would do next, isn't certain. What is certain, however, is the unquestionable betrayal that Victor would soon commit. One day, during one of Margaret and Otto's moments alone, Victor told Mendez what was happening between the 2 of them. He betrayed his closest friends because of his jealousy, his feelings for Margaret. Needless to say, Mendez wasn't pleased. Margaret was berated for her actions, and he threw them both in the brig, separate from one another, of course. This alone wasn't what would truly fracture Black Team's relationship with one another, though. Instead, it was an unintended side effect that caused the real problems. You see, another group of Spartan 2s, Red Team, were training nearby when he decided to tattle on his friends. It's unclear how exactly Red Team heard about what Margaret and Otto were doing, but it's fairly easy to assume that because of the Spartan 2's heightened senses, they could have overheard the conversation. To say that they were displeased with what Victor was telling Mendez would be quite the understatement. They believed that Spartans were bigger than that they were beyond such immature things, and that Margaret and Otto's stolen time together was unacceptable. That somehow their love for one another was jeopardizing their training, and because of this, they needed to be taught a lesson. So, Red Team armed themselves with batons and snuck into the brig where Margaret was being held. They entered her cell and began beating her for her actions. Margaret fought back as best she could, but to say it was an unfair and uneven fight doesn't even begin to cut it. In such a brutal 4v1, Margaret was overwhelmed and subsequently blinded in her left eye. It's unclear who exactly was part of Red Team at this time, so we don't know who committed such an atrocious act. It could have been instigated by Jerome, the leader of the current version of Red Team, as his upbringing prior to his indoctrination encouraged him to take on a life of crime and violence. It's impossible to say for sure. What we do know, however, is that this version of Red Team consisted of 2 men and 2 women. The loss of Margaret's eye didn't exactly go unnoticed. Mendez was furious, and rightfully so. Not only are heaps of the UNSC's resources poured into the Spartan 2 program and the candidates themselves, but whether or not Mendez will admit it, he loves his Spartans and doesn't want to see them injured or killed. He'd much rather spend their lives on the battlefield rather than waste them over something so petty. So, he grilled Margaret. He asked her who'd done these horrible things to her, but she refused to tell him. She had other plans in mind. Let's just say that Otto, Roma, and Victor were a little displeased with Red Team's treatment of Margaret. Together, the 4 of them would take revenge on Red Team. They'd show them a fair fight and show them how things could have gone had they been present alongside Margaret. Red Team learned their lesson. Despite their camaraderie in punishing Red Team, the loss of Margaret's eye would deeply scar Black Team and would create problems between them that no one could foresee. Guilt, jealousy, anger, these emotions can't be bottled up and kept in because eventually they'll come back to haunt you. Much like other Spartan 2s, Black Team would be assigned nearly impossible tasks with immeasurably small windows of success. One such occasion would take them to the previously human-occupied planet, Verge. Much like many planets before it and after it, the surface had been ravaged by highly concentrated beams of plasma. Beams focused from above and used to bombard the surface of a planet, to turn its once grassy slopes and bustling cities into jagged, razor-sharp glass. But this planet hadn't been completely glassed, not yet, which is precisely why Black Team was sent here. The reason Verge wasn't completely destroyed yet was because of valuable helium deposits, a resource that the Covenant intended to harness before completely annihilating the planet. But Black Team wasn't here to save Verge. Everyone had already been evacuated. They were here to hurt the Covenant by disrupting the supply chain to a fleet outside of another colony, currently preventing people from escaping by creating a blockade. If they could complete their mission here on Verge, they could give the colonists there, on the planet Tribute, a fighting chance. Black Team are Spartans, though, highly trained soldiers. They don't go in guns blazing. That's how you get killed. So first they would conduct a little recon. Black Team's target was a massive structure that the UNSC simply dubbed a beacon. They're monstrous machines that are nearly 50 stories tall and 5 city blocks wide. It reminded Black Team of a great big beehive complete with a swarm of angry bees perched atop 4 anti-gravity stilts. These angry bees weren't really bees, of course. The Covenant hadn't decided to take up farming. No, this was a swarm of giant insectoids, a swarm of yanme'e, otherwise known as drones. It seemed as though this group of drones were actually much like honeybees, though, in the sense that this particular swarm appeared to be nothing but workers. The drones were being funneled beneath the planet's surface with handheld mining tools that allowed them to remove large chunks of bedrock in order to expose and collect the valuable helium hidden under the planet's crust. Every so often, a drone would fly away from the rest of the swarm in what appeared to be a confused and definitely spastic fashion, upon which a group of kig'yar, jackals, would descend on the drone with long purple-pink poles and begin prodding the drone in the neck where a strange collar was affixed to the creature. Every time the jackals poked the bugger, it would quake and screech in pain before quickly returning back to the giant swarm. This was a strange sight, to say the least, but no one was exactly surprised. After all, the Covenant was an imperialistic empire with several different species they had at one time conquered. You don't exactly get that much power being nice. They needed some time to really plan this out, though. A swarm of anxious drones helped complicate things. So Margaret sent Roma to find a place they could hide and get some sleep if need be. They weren't exactly sure how long they'd be here. Roma complied and started her search. Eventually, she found herself in the living room of a long-abandoned penthouse. Within the penthouse, beside the charred and blackened remains of a couch, sat a single drone. But something seemed amiss about the beast. Something compelled her not to shoot. As she watched the bugger, she realized it was flailing about and trying to flip itself over. For some reason, it was really struggling. She approached slowly and with her rifle trained on it. It didn't appear to have any weapons, but she wasn't going to take any chances. Those things have a surprisingly good shot. She placed her boot underneath the disoriented drone and flipped it over with her foot. Now upright, the oversized cockroach stared at her quizzically. Roma fiddled with a compartment on her armor's forearm. Eventually it opened, and within it was a translation device that utilized every scrap of knowledge that the UNSC had on Covenant languages. With the device in hand, she questioned the creature. She asked it to identify itself and what its purpose was. The device produced a few faint clicks in an attempt to replicate the drone's language, but the creature didn't seem to understand. It stared at her blankly with a slight cock to its head. A few moments passed by before the drone extended its claw and gestured for Roma to hand it the translator. This was getting strange, to say the least. The technologies contained within the device didn't appear to really be effective, so she saw no harm in giving it to the creature. It was strictly against UNSC protocol to allow any UNSC tech to fall into the hands of the Covenant, but this was just too weird. Besides, the translator was created to understand the Covenant, something the Covenant themselves clearly wouldn't have any use for. She handed it the translator. The drone rearranged some circuits and wires blazingly fast, and suddenly the translator worked. The drone was able to speak to her. She quickly tapped her radio and called for the rest of Black Team. Once they arrived, were inevitably shocked by the outlandish nature of the situation, and finally had a moment to relax, they redirected their thoughts from kill to listen. Roma had made quite the discovery, and the rest of Black Team needed to be briefed. Now that the translator worked properly, Roma and the drone, which she had dubbed Hopalong on account of its missing legs, had created a bit of a plan on how to proceed. You see, Hopalong, along with all of the other drones, absolutely hated the Jackals and the Covenant. The Jackals were responsible for cutting off Hopalong's legs, and the Covenant as a whole were responsible for killing the drone's original leaders and forcing them to worship the prophets. Needless to say, Black Team shared Hopalong's disdain for the Covenant. This common ground would help them form a truce. The creature assured them that the other drones felt the same and that the entire hive would help. With Hopalong's intimate knowledge of the surrounding area, Black Team's explosives and, legs, together they could destroy the beacon and free Hopalong's hive. The Spartans get to complete their objective, giving tribute some much-needed breathing room, and Hopalong and his swarm get their freedom. Win-win. And thus, an uneasy alliance was formed. Was Hopalong lying? It was impossible to say. Black Team weren't exactly experts in alien body language. Given the strange and unique circumstances, Black Team decided to trust the creature. For now. Hopalong eventually led them to a tunnel that stretched far beneath the planet's crust. He then gave them a data wafer that basically functioned as a map. This map would help guide Black Team through a complex network of tunnels and show them which of these tunnels were either abandoned or still occupied by other Covenant forces. With great intrepidation and much to Otto's dismay, Victor slid the wafer into the back of his helmet to upload the information into his HUD. Victor's bravery, or foolishness as Otto felt inclined to point out, eventually inspired the other members of Black Team to do the same. Together, the far-fetched fellowship marched forward through tunnels infested with sleeping drones. Hopalong had assured them that all the other drones wanted the same thing as him, but Black Team wasn't going to take any chances. They moved fast and quiet and passed through without any real consequence. The beacon was powered by several pylons that were all relatively spread apart, so Black Team would need to split up in 4 directions, each of them picking a pylon to destroy. Once they found them, they would place explosives on the base and rendezvous back to a set location where Hopalong was waiting. Finally, when everyone was accounted for, Black Team would tell Hopalong the good news, then he could pass it on to the rest of the swarm, and they could all get the hell out of here. Using the map Hopalong had provided, they each set out after a pylon. In Roma's search for her designated pylon, she eventually stumbled upon a group of jackals. Fortunately, she caught them unaware and eliminated them. A couple of kig'yar are no match for Spartan. One of them dropped a strange smoky cube with several different Covenant characters and images cycling on it. She picked the cube up and watched it quizzically. Each image was of a drone with its wings extended. She touched the cube's surface and it flashed through a series of 3-dimensional images depicting drones smashing their own species' eggs and different scenes of mangled headless and limbless drone corpses, bodies torn and smashed in various places. Accompanying every new image was the same kig'yar symbol. She whipped out her translator and scanned the symbol. It took a moment to give her something useful, but eventually it read, unmutual, or incapable of socialization. Before she could ponder what this meant, her attention was turned to a pair of incoming hunters. Hunters may be a more fair or even fight for a Spartan, but she quickly eliminated the first and began planning on how to eliminate the second when suddenly Hopalong appeared. The hunter immediately lost interest in Roma and turned its attention to the bugger. In its claws was the cube Roma had held earlier. Suddenly the realization hit her. Unmutual mutual, incapable of socialization. All those dead drones and spattered eggs. These drones weren't slaves. They were a penal colony, a swarm of prisoners forced to work after they murdered and maimed their own children. These drones were incompatible with one another. They couldn't function like a coherent hive, but that wouldn't stop the Covenant from forcing them to. A drone swarm was a valuable and useful resource to the Covenant, and they clearly intended to use it, despite its obvious flaws. The Spartans had been tricked. The drones wanted freedom, all right, but they certainly didn't deserve it. They had essentially created an alliance with hundreds of lying, psychopathic murderers. Hopalong must have realized right then and there that she had figured it out. She saw the cube. He fluttered towards the swarm and disappeared into their midst. The group of insectoids slammed into the hunter like a semi-truck, then lifted the beast high into the air, only to drop it back down, smashing the creature to ribbons. Suddenly, the swarm's attention was turned back to Roma, and using her enhanced muscles and Mjolnir power armor, she ran as fast as she could towards her objective, an angry drone swarm hot on her heels. She dropped an explosive on her assigned pylon and sprinted with all her strength away from the gnashing jaws of 1,000 giant angry cockroaches. As she ran, Margaret's voice crackled over her radio. Apparently all hell had broken loose there too, because she asked, "Who's dead?" Roma responded. Victor responded, but Otto was silent. Roma elected to search for their comrade, but Margaret encouraged her not to. She didn't want to lose 2 Spartans today. One can only imagine how heartbreaking it must have been for Margaret to make that call. But somehow Roma was able to hear Otto breathing over their team comm and deduced he was simply unconscious, not dead. Using her armor's motion sensor, she ran towards Otto's location. She followed the signal to the top of a nearby skyscraper, and when she arrived, she saw Otto laying on the ground, struggling with a drone on top of him. The swarm had picked him up and dropped him from up high, much like they did the hunter. When he landed, his ankle broke. His armor tried to fix it by filling the wound with biofoam, but the foam just pinned it in its broken shape, leaving him unable to walk. Roma raised her rifle and aimed it at the drone and realized it was Hopalong. She didn't hesitate. She pulled the trigger and blasted the drone, knocking him off of Otto and off the building. She quickly sprinted to Otto, threw him over her shoulder, and jumped off of the skyscraper. She landed with a thud, took a moment to recover, and sprinted away. As she ran, she glanced behind her and could see Hopalong leading a pack of ravenous and livid drones, his front legs blown off from when she had shot him earlier. Suddenly, a huge explosion rattled Roma's teeth. Margaret had detonated the explosives they had planted on the beacon pylons. The pylons started to fall, and the beacon was most assuredly destroyed. Fire rolled in all directions, engulfing Hopalong and much of the hive with him. Roma jumped into a subway tunnel, and ahead of her could see a moving train, traveling away from the explosions. On the back of that train was a pair of outstretched Spartan arms. She ran forward as the tunnel collapsed behind her, leapt off the ground, and grabbed her friend's hands. Together, the 4 of them rode through the darkness. They'd completed their mission. Now it was time to rest. Spartans don't usually get a lot of shore leave, though, and Black Team is no different. Soon they'd be sent on a new assignment, one where their past would truly begin to rear its ugly head. The next part of this story begins aboard a UNSC ship dubbed Oasis 6. The ship's AI, an AI with a bit of a fiery attitude and snarky disposition, not too dissimilar from Cortana's, had picked up a strange transmission. It was strangely simplistic, though, and utilized things the Covenant simply wouldn't. This AI's name was Iona, and Iona, like all other smart AIs, is very intelligent. Given enough time, she would be able to discern what the message meant. The moment she was able to formulate an accurate assessment, the Oasis was hit with some kind of EMP pulse, thereby disabling the ship's thrusters and causing the ship to get sucked into the gravitational pull of a nearby planet. The message was a warning about a series of astronavigational hazards. Her discovery, however, was too little too late. The ship was already caught in the planet's gravity well and plummeting fast. Meanwhile, a Covenant ship had locked onto the signal too, and they were investigating. The ship's pilot was a Sangheli, an elite, and an unusual one. This elite, Thon, unlike many other members of his species, wasn't exactly a religious zealot, and immediately dismissed the notion that this signal could be Forerunner and therefore holy. His brother Ref, on the other hand, was convinced it could be, and that perhaps this signal could help lead them on the path to transcendence, the Great Journey. Thon was far more pragmatic than his brother, and wasn't naive enough to think the universe revolved around them, so he ordered the crew of their ship to make the jump to slipspace. But much like the Oasis before them, it was too late. The same EMP burst that knocked out the Oasis cut the power on Thon's ship, and it too began its descent to the planet's surface. The Oasis's crash was violent and catastrophic. No one survived the crash landing. No one except a particularly grumpy group of Spartan 2s, Black Team. Iona released them from their cryo chambers, and soon they were tending to the ship's wounds, almost wordlessly acting with surgical precision, putting out fires, clearing debris, and finally, retrieving Iona. It amazed her. Victor grabbed Iona's housing and shoved it into the port specially created for smart AIs in the back of his head. The atmosphere on this planet wasn't exactly breathable, so they had to move fast. Their armor had built-in O2 units, but their supplies certainly wouldn't last forever. Only one oxygen breather survived the crash, so Roma stayed behind with it and raised a distress beacon. The other 3 Spartans, with Iona in tow, commandeered a Warthog and busted their way out of the crashed ship. Upon exiting the Oasis, the Spartans were greeted with quite the sight. Their ship wasn't the first to be violently pulled onto the planet's surface. This place was a ship graveyard. It wasn't long before Victor, Otto, Margaret, and Iona ran into some resistance, specifically a Wraith. Apparently, the elite brothers had fared much better than the Oasis. Their ship may have been disabled, but they had plenty of surviving troops, including this Wraith. The Spartans got straight to work, pouring gunfire into the Wraith's hull, but suddenly several giant tentacle-bearing robots burst forth and began grabbing and vaporizing parts of Black Team's opposition. These things, Dr. Octopus-like appendages, writhed and coiled around a grunt and a hunter and lifted them into a couple of strange purple pods. The tentacled machinations fired wildly in all directions at both sides of the conflict as their long arms slithered up and around Margaret and Ref and pulled the 2 of them into the strange purple tubes as well. Then, just like that, the monstrous machines flew away, leaving the previous battle and fracturing the Spartans' group in thons. But Black Team wasn't about to let some Doc Ock ripoff abduct their friend. Utilizing the confusion created by the machines, the Spartans slipped away from the rest of Thon's group and began following the abductors. Eventually, they arrived at a giant Forerunner structure. They pursued the machines quickly and made it inside before the door sealed behind them. The moment they entered the structure, a swarm of sentinels appeared and began blasting them with concentrated beams of pure energy. The Spartans fired back, of course, and quickly eliminated them. The following struggle depleted most of Victor and Otto's resources. They were dangerously low on ammo and certainly wouldn't have enough to proceed if there was more sentinels or if they wanted to eliminate the tentacled constructs. On the other side of the giant Forerunner door, Thon's group had caught up, and they were trying to get into the structure. Thon had a hunter fire at the door repeatedly with several concussive blasts from his shoulder-mounted fuel rod cannon. With each blast, Thon began to lose hope. They couldn't break through this, and he'd never see his brother again. Spartans, on the other hand, thrived in situations like this, so they started to come up with a plan. Not too dissimilar from their temporary pact with Hopalong, Victor suggested that they open the door and form a truce with Thon. His logic was that, because they had lost people too, they'd be willing to give each other a hand. The enemy of my enemy and all that. Otto didn't agree. He raised his magnum and pointed it at Victor's head. Fraternizing with the enemy wasn't exactly a crime the UNSC took too kindly. Iona, being inside Victor's head, began to see the source of the Spartans' true disagreement, and it had nothing to do with the Covenant forces outside. Remember, Victor was the one who told Mendez about Otto and Margaret's alone time. But in Victor's mind, he was the one who had the relationship with Margaret, and somehow Otto was the one who ratted him out. So he managed to completely convince himself that Otto had wronged him. He was absolutely certain that this delusion was reality. Was it the guilt of betraying his peers that caused his mind to break, or the shock of Margaret's true feelings for Otto and not Victor? No one can say for certain. What can be said for certain, however, is that Victor had genuinely convinced himself his version of events were true. So much so that even Iona, who was quite literally in his head, was convinced. Otto may still have been hurt about everything that happened, but his duty came first. He reconsidered Victor's suggestion, lowered his weapon, and Iona opened the door. Iona told Thon that if he agreed to a temporary ceasefire, that they'd let them into the facility, no strings attached. Together they'd help him find his brother and Margaret. With much intrepidation, Thon agreed. Meanwhile, Margaret, Ref, a hunter, and a grunt were all stuck inside some kind of strange holding cells. The transparent walls of these tubes were impervious to Margaret's augmented strength, so she had no choice but to simply wait. Outside of her cell was a full clip of assault rifle ammo that must have fallen out of her possession when the machines carried her into the holding chamber, if only she could reach it. Ref offered to teach her the ways of the great journey. In his mind, he was offering to save her in the eyes of his gods, as they may have been approaching the final moments of their lives. Suddenly, a small, round, cycloptic robot floated into the room and announced itself. It explained that it was the monitor of line installation 1 through 4. Its designation was 686 Ebullient Prism, and that its function was to collect and inspect specimens within the sector for any evidence of immunity to the flood. The tube in which the hunter was contained suddenly lit up, and beams of red energy pulsed throughout the chamber before the creature exploded and vaporized. Margaret wasn't exactly sure what Prism was referring to. She wasn't privy to information regarding the flood. She had no idea what that even meant. Oni, a clandestine government organization that silently ruled over the humans' political and military landscapes, kept that secret. What she did know was that this orb, this prism, was clearly hostile, and she sure as hell wasn't going to suffer the same fate as that hunter. As Ref and Margaret stewed on their situation, Otto, Victor, and Thon's group continued to push through the facility, killing sentinels along the way and slowly realizing that maybe, just maybe, they weren't so different after all. Thon loved his brother and had cared for and helped him since they were young children. He had saved him from dying many times. You see, Ref was the weakest of their clutch, and according to Sangheili tradition, he would die while training for battle as he was unfit to continue their bloodline. But despite that, Thon saved his brother time and time again because he loved him, a choice that Otto intimately understood. Eventually, they would reach a crossroads, 2 split paths, and decided that they better divide their groups into 2 and head off in both directions. The Spartans would take one route, and Thon's group would take the other. Before they separated, Thon approached Victor and handed him a carbine. According to Thon, he was honor-bound to ensure that his new, albeit temporary, allies were well-equipped. Prism eventually reappeared, and this time aimed to dissect Margaret. But before the Monitor got the chance, Ref spoke up and expressed his discontent. He believed that everyone had a right to the great journey, despite what the prophets may have said. He wanted to help Margaret believe. Why he felt such compassion for the enemy, it's impossible to know for sure. But his words would prove to save Margaret's life and postpone the Monitor's vile vivisection. Ref began his religious spiel, and somehow something he had said convinced the Monitor that they must be studied further before dissection. So instead, the Monitor activated the chamber that housed the grunt. The poor creature didn't even have the time to react, and like a violent volcano, its body erupted, launching a hail of blue blood and fragments of bone in all directions, coating the inside of the cell that contained it. All Margaret and Ref could do was watch in horror, wondering which one of them would be next. Otto and Victor continued to trudge through the facility when sudden sniper fire caught them by surprise. A red-hot beam of energy impacted Otto and pierced straight through his armor's energy shielding, momentarily crippling the Spartan where he once stood. It was Thon. Victor surmised that the elite must have backtracked to get an open shot on them. An odd move considering his honor-bound nature. Victor climbed up towards the source of the beam rifle shot and took aim, utilizing the carbine that Thon had given him not so long ago. He placed the Sangheli's head in his crosshairs and pulled the trigger, blasting his head apart as if he was Gallagher, and Thon's head was a watermelon. Otto remained on the ground, crippled from the beam rifle shot, when Thon and his group strolled into the room as if nothing had just happened. Not knowing that this entire situation was impossible and that Victor had just seemingly killed Thon, Otto opened fire, killing one of the grunts in Thon's party. Meanwhile, Victor cautiously approached Thon's body and came to the horrific conclusion that he had actually shot Roma, not Thon. But that didn't make any sense. He saw Thon. He knew how to identify a target. He'd never mistake Roma for an ugly split chin. And yet here she was, her lifeless and limp body sprawled out before him. Completely unbeknownst to Victor, Iona had just been informed of a frightening new complication. Prism had somehow hacked into her matrix and was stopping her from communicating with Black Team. And worse yet, it was interfering with their armor's HUD, making Roma look like Thon in an attempt to sabotage the Spartans' shaky truce with Thon's squad. Prism revealed to the AI that it had infiltrated Roma's helmet display as well, making Otto and Victor appear to be Covenant. Victor collapsed onto his knees. How could he not know it was Roma? How could he kill one of his closest friends? Iona wanted to reach out to him, to comfort him and tell him what was really happening, but Prism wouldn't let her. She was powerless. Prism's nefarious scheme was working perfectly. The fight erupted between Otto and Thon's group. The trauma of killing Roma sent Victor into a full-blown psychotic break. Prism altered his visor to display all of Thon's group to look like Otto. Victor grabbed the beam rifle and began firing wildly at everyone down below him, nailing a shot on a grunt and Otto. Everyone took cover, and Thon and Otto both quickly realized there was something amiss here. Why would Victor be shooting at Otto? Nothing about this made any sense. While absolute chaos ensued, Iona was doing her best to fight Prism off. Prism was trying his hardest to delete her, and in a way, she was running for her life. She finally managed to give the machine the slip long enough to tell Otto what was going on, explaining to him that Victor still blamed Otto for betraying him by telling Mendez about his relationship with Margaret. But that wasn't true. Victor had just convinced himself it was. His delusion was going to get them all killed. In the meantime, Margaret had come up with an insane plan on how to escape. She convinced Prism to dissect her first instead of Ref. He couldn't believe it. A human had just elected to save his life. Even if it was only for a few moments, Ref was blown away. Prism complied. The chamber containing her roared to life, and like the hunter and the grunt before her, harsh beams of red energy filled the tube. Using her helmet's visor, she reflected a beam downward onto the clip of assault rifle ammo, igniting it instantly and blasting the chambers, imprisoning them apart and completely obliterating one of the nearby tentacle-bearing machines. She grabbed a weapon fallen from the destroyed robot, pointed it at Prism, and fired. The first shot only seemed to anger the Monitor, though, so Margaret and Ref ran, continuously pouring fire into the Monitor's newly recruited Sentinels. The Sentinels exploded and their beam emitters crashed to the floor. Ref quickly scooped one up and fired a beam at Prism, hitting it directly in the eye. Even without Prism's illusion, Victor wanted to kill Otto. Iona tried to calm Victor down to convince him that he didn't need to fight Otto, but nothing she said stifled his rage. Margaret suddenly spoke, and spoke directly to Victor. She said, "I forgive you." And just like that, he stopped struggling. With tears streaming down his hidden face, he dropped his weapon and stopped trying to hurt Otto. Now reunited, one of the hunters in Thawne's group immediately lunged at Margaret, impacting her head with its great and powerful arm. She fell to the ground, momentarily stunned from the devastating blow. Ref urged it to stop, explaining that he and Margaret had helped each other fight off the Monitor together. He didn't want to harm her, but Thawne had upheld his end of the bargain. His truce with the Spartans was over. They'd all been reunited, and now they could go back to killing each other. A Covenant fleet was en route to their location. Thawne turned to Ref and asked if there was any way to contact the fleet from here. Ref said yes and stepped away from Thawne's side and suggested that instead of summoning the fleet, he'd use the power of the facility to destroy it. He would kill the false prophets aboard the ships and start a new covenant. He would lead them to glorious transcendence. In his mind, that was why he was here. Destiny willed it so. He was alive for this reason. Thawne protested. Now was not the time for heresy. Thawne couldn't let Ref endanger them all with such a ridiculous notion. If Ref failed, they'd surely be executed, and worse, their entire bloodline would be dishonored forever. Ref hadn't survived due to fate. He'd survived because Thawne wanted him to. Thawne kept him alive, but no more. This was the final straw. He reached for his sword, but his hand found no purchase. It was missing from its holster. In an instant, Ref grabbed Thawne, spun him around, and plunged his own brother's sword deep into his back, practically cutting him in two. Ref walked away from Thawne's lifeless body and approached a console that controlled the station's defenses and began configuring them to fire on the Covenant fleet. The surviving members of Thawne's group watched in complete shock and confusion. Prism entered the room and spoke directly to Ref, urging the elite to step away from the console. He refused, claiming that this was his destiny and that only he could unite all races, human and Covenant, and lead them all on the path to the great journey. A concentrated beam of fiery red energy blasted forth from the Monitor's eye and impacted Ref, vaporizing his entire body, leaving nothing but the charred stumps of his legs. Black Team took this opportunity to begin firing at Prism, pushing the orb back further and further until it hovered within a giant tubular structure. Even Roma appeared. Thanks to the biofoam injectors in her armor, she'd survived the beam rifle shot and was ready to give her teammates the hand they desperately needed. Prism had simply made her injuries appear far greater to Victor than they really were. Margaret activated the console that Ref was about to fire, and a sudden burst of blue energy blasted Prism out of the air, sending shrapnel flying in all directions, while simultaneously hitting the entire Covenant fleet with the same EMP burst that had caused Black Team to crash here in the first place. Each and every ship began its violent descent to the planet's surface. Iona did a quick scan of the crashed ships and found that one of them had an operable slipspace drive. They could use that to escape this hellhole. The catch was that about 100 or so of the Covenant troops survived the fall as well. 100 Covenant soldiers versus 4 Spartans and a highly advanced, overly intelligent, smart AI? That was almost a fair fight. Almost a fair fight for the Covenant. These events made Black Team's bond that much stronger, and the newest member to their family, Iona, fit like a glove. Black Team's next recorded mission would take them to a Halo ring, specifically Gamma Halo, the one briefly featured in Halo 4. Here they would guard a science team and protect them from harm's way in case anything bad should happen. Halo rings aren't exactly the safest of places. While on patrol, Black Team noticed multiple slipspace signatures opening up in the sky. Something was falling from the atmosphere. Whatever they were, one of them came down close by, so they cautiously approached. Laying on the ground was a colossal humanoid wrapped in a silvery gray armor. The being suddenly rose and hovered above the ground, towering above and looming over Black Team. This thing, this humanoid, was none other than the Didact. The same Didact that the Chief had knocked into slipspace and supposedly defeated during the Requiem campaign. No one knows exactly how the conflict between the Didact and Black Team went, but surely Black Team put up one hell of a fight. Ultimately, however, it doesn't matter. They lost. The Didact slaughtered them all. Just like that, Black Team's story is over. Killed off in the least ceremonious way in a mere 4 pages of a comic book that doesn't even star them. These extremely well-written and entirely unique characters were instantaneously killed off as a simple demonstration of the Didact's power, something we're all surely already aware of. Hell, they're not even given a proper death scene. One panel we see them dead, and the next we see them moments before they died. But, there still remains some hope, however. The writer's intention may have been to kill off Black Team for good, but during their death scene, their faces are never shown and their names are never dropped. It's entirely possible that maybe, just maybe, Black Team wasn't killed. Perhaps a group of Spartan 4s were simply testing a new kind of armor for Black Team. This wouldn't be the first time this has happened. Maria, a retired Spartan 2, tested the Chief's armor upgrade in Halo 2 before he was given it. It's possible the same thing could have happened here. We can't say for certain. What we can say, however, is that for now, the tragic story of Black Team has concluded. Thanks so much for watching. This video was quite the undertaking to produce, so it would mean the world to me if you would subscribe, hit that bell to enable notifications from my channel, and like this video. It really helps a ton. Plus, by enabling notifications, you'll never miss out on any videos that I produce. It would also be extremely helpful if you shared this video. I've got a lot more stuff like this planned, so stick around. Maybe next time I'll talk about some grunt lore. I love those little guys. Well, that's all I've got for now. I'll see you soon.